I've come to the conclusion more than once that events which, at the time, pretty much suck ass in hell, with the benefit in hindsight and distance of a few months become pretty much sweet memories. I mean, to give a convenient example, staying up till 4:30 in the morning, desperately trying to assemble and pack boxes of CDs that we hadn't even finished making yet, so we could make the next day's post. This was, on the face of it, pretty fucking grim. In the end, I was running on black coffee and paranoia, and I found myself sat with Russ on the living room floor as the sun started to rise. Sketched out, we watched bugs crawl across my carpet, and wrapped mountains of parcel tape around what used to be a computer box, but now contained somewhere around a zillion zines and CDRs. Like I said, pretty fucking grim. Oh yeah, and that motherfucker weighed a ton and cost a fortune to post. But on the flip side, we also stayed up till the sun came up, making CDs and posting a parcel that cost far more than I could really afford. And how often do you do that? Seriously, how satisfying is it to see a big pile of stuff that you've not only written, but hacked up the photocopied sleeves, spray painted the back of the CDRs, and assembled in the shortest time possible? Seriously, try standing in the garden with red and black spray cans and a few hundred CDRs at midnight. In retrospect, it's pretty fucking sweet. And I think that's one of the paradoxes about DIY culture. You get to do a bunch of crazy shit that you otherwise wouldn't get to do. But on the flip side, it's pretty hard graft, and you may be forced to go a few days without changing your pants. Accept that compromise, and the fact that your expendable earnings will disappear into the unfathomable void, and you're all set for adventure, fucko. Richmond, Virginia. We'd been to our first basement show that evening. I don't exactly remember how it went, but I do remember the black mould on the floor, the 40-ounce Miller highlights, and the fact I thought the bands were pretty sweet. And it was hot, so hot that when we returned to the Flying Brick library, where we were going to spend the night, sweat just ran down my face, making it hard to read my emails. In a few days, this same heat would cause an attractive rash on my hands. They would kill the skin and make it peel off in sheets. In fact, I was probably already itching. The Flying Brick was a collective house in the older, working-class Carver, Oregon Hill neighbourhood, which was also a public library, full of radical literature and zines. I spent a lot of my time in the USA getting excited about stuff like this, about people getting together and creating their own venues, where they could create their own culture in a way that was far more accommodating and flexible than the pub-orientated hardcore scene I was used to. I'm continually impressed, by the way, our ingenuity and networks can create projects that allow us to achieve far more than the sum of our parts. Everywhere we went, there were attempts to create alternatives, be that radical vegan cafes, zine libraries, community spaces, or simply houses where, for better or for worse, the owners had decided to let bands play and strangers sleep. As if to highlight the fact that so much of what we experienced was simply built by kids using the spaces available, in the same way a lot of the houses we played in were just regular homes. I remember the Flying Brick looked a lot like other buildings in the area, like the stereotypical image you probably have in your head of old wooden American houses, complete with front porch. Total Southern American Gothic style. I guess you probably wouldn't know it was there unless you looked for it. Within an hour of getting back to the house, Greg, from Complete Control Zine, took us through the winding residential streets down to a local water fountain. The beer wearing off, we walked past Tim Barry's house, and in a total bizarre "let's go to RVA and we'll see a Vale" twist, he was sat on his porch and said hi, which seemed kind of odd for some reason. Then everyone stripped off to their underwear and got wet. The highlight of the Civil War cemetery was a huge pyramid memorial to 14,000 dead soldiers of the Confederacy. It stretched up in the darkness like a huge pile of skulls, the stones irregular shapes and not exactly fitting one another, leaving numerous handholds and crevices for the brave soul who was insane enough to climb it. No one I was with would dare even put their hands inside a crack, except maybe Greg, who presumably had been there enough times not to expect a huge eye to open near its point. Our group was split in two, with most of our friends heading for an all-night cafe after calling off. Me, Russ, Mike and a few Canadian radical puppeteers, who were also staying at Flying Brick, had taken Greg up on his offer of a tour, and we scrambled like extras from a bad zombie film down an embankment that used to be the fenced-off edge of a road, at least until a landslide took it out. The cemetery itself was huge, stretching off into the darkness, and as we marched up the hill, walking carefully between the stones, all I could think of was a graveyard in the remake of The Night of the Living Dead, and how similar it looked, with well-kept lawns and neat graves. Someone, probably Mike, told us about wandering around the Louisville graveyard from Return of the Living Dead, one with a crematorium and a medical storage facility next to it, where the goth girl gets naked for no reason other than it's a low-budget classic. It was pretty fucking creepy. You could almost hear the anguished moans of long-dead Civil War troops, filled with a hatred for the living, an unquenchable thirst for brains, and a bad Cramp soundtrack. No one ate our heads or died horribly, although getting out of the cemetery was harder than getting in. We had to climb over a spiked fence, a kind that could have threatened to end my love life for good. We walked back through a quiet neighbourhood, listening to Greg talk about the changes that had taken place. In Complete Control Zine, Greg writes a lot about Richmond and the changes that had taken place in the area as a result of creeping gentrification. I've read about gentrification in zines before, but it was later on in New York that I really saw its effect on an area that had probably once been a rough working class neighbourhood, but now seemed to be full of cafes, health food shops and art spaces. It made me wonder what had been there originally, if not this, and where it had all been displaced to. We beat the others back to the house and sat there sweating in the living room, waiting to check our mail again and write home about everything. I wish I kept a better diary and copies of these long emails, because I've never been on a long trip like this. I didn't realise how quickly details and images and places all blur into one. Everyone asked me when I got back how the trip was, and it was impossible to know where to begin, how to explain all the ups and downs and crazy shit we'd seen. It was impossible to articulate the highs and lows in a way that kept someone else's attention, so I just mumbled that I had a good time. Maybe if I documented it better at the time, stories would come to me easier later on, because each time I try and break it down to soundbite-sized chunks, they seem meaningless and out of context. But I've a sneaky suspicion, if I had, even then the only structure would have been a road narrative of one day after the next, and I'd be left trying to string events together and find themes, trying to fit things into an easy literary package when, like all life, it's also just a jumble of random stuff. Whatever.